Not all index funds are good. This is a really important fact to keep in mind when choosing an index tracker. You might already be familiar with checking the ongoing charges figure or total expense ratio to make sure it's a low-cost fund, but it's not just the fee that matters. There's something else you should always make sure to look at before buying an index fund. Always check how closely the fund tracks its benchmark index. Let me explain why, and then show you how to do this for any index fund. But firstly, why should we even care? Well, picture this. You find a fund with a super low expense ratio. Sounds like a good deal, right? But wait a second. If that fund is trailing behind its index by 2% every year, it's actually costing you around 2% more than you bargained for. And the bigger that gap, the more suspicious you should be. But why don't trackers perfectly mirror their benchmark's returns? Well, index funds usually don't include every single company in their index, but a broadly representative sample of them. There are also costs associated with running a fund, which don't apply to the index itself. This is why a fund's performance usually won't match its index exactly, but you do want it to be as close as possible. So how can we check this? We can look at something called tracking difference. Tracking difference is simply a comparison of the total fund return versus the total index return. It tells you how closely the fund has been tracking its benchmark index. For example, let's imagine we have a unicorn growth ETF, which tracks the magical horned creatures index. The ETF returns 1%, and the index returns 1.5%. In this case, the tracking difference is 0.5%. This gives you a more accurate picture of the actual cost of owning that fund, regardless of the expense ratio. So what's an acceptable tracking difference? When comparing similar funds, a good general rule is to choose the one with the lowest tracking difference over the longest time period possible. You want to compare at least 1 year of returns, but ideally 3 or even 5 years if you can. Let's look at an example of how to compare some different low-cost index funds using the free charting tool from TrustNet. We'll compare 2 different tracker funds for the FTSE All-World Index, which tracks stocks from developed and emerging countries around the world. Here you can see the Vanguard FTSE All-World UCITS ETF in yellow and the HSBC FTSE All-World Index Fund in blue. And now let's add the index itself in red. You can see that they're all similar, but the Vanguard ETF tracks the index more closely. So closely, in fact, that you can't even see the yellow line on the graph once we added the index. If we look at the annualized returns, the HSBC fund has slightly underperformed the index over 3 years and outperformed it by 0.5% over 5 years. So it actually has a positive tracking difference there. So this fund is outperforming its index? Isn't that good news? Well, not exactly. Trackers are supposed to keep pace with the market, not deviate from it, in either direction. So when a tracker starts straying too far from its index, it's a sign that something's not quite right with the fund. Oh, and just because this happens to be working in the fund's favour right now, that situation could easily reverse when the market conditions change. The Vanguard fund has managed to exactly match the index over both those time periods. Overall though, these are both very similar funds. The Vanguard ETF has less tracking difference, so it wins there, but the HSBC fund is close enough that either would be a good choice.